show you a few slides to be sure that we're all on the same page and talking about the same thing, and then I'll give you my explanation of where they come from. The Ozarks frontier of recreation began during the 1880s when middle-class town folk began to go to the rivers dressed in Sunday clothes for fellowship, frolic, and good eats. They canoed downstream for hours and then days and swapped tales about local color. By 1903, Charlie Barnes and his brothers in Galena began to offer guide services, an amenity that many other merchants on the Ozark rivers quickly adopted. Guides guided, cooked dinner, instructed on where floaters could expect the best fishing, and once camped on the gravel bars, guides told stories for entertainment. Stories wouldn't be stories without embellishment, so Ozarks folklore grew exponentially with the increasing recreational trade, a trade that often included journalists from urban newspapers who reported on their trips. Before long, vacationers were assured through feature stories that time spent in the Ozarks would not only include picturesque landscapes, but being entertained by the natives could be a special treat. And if you were lucky enough to have Tom Yoakum as your host on the James River, or hear James Parnell spin yarns at Branson on White River, it was a special treat indeed. Fortunately, Otto Ernest Rayburn and Vance Randolph decided to devote their lives and their fortunes to documenting a vibrant Ozarks culture. Randolph titled it, "We Always Lie to Strangers." The Ozarks yarns over the years have become so strongly entrenched that in the late 20th century, many are told for gospel, or at least for history. However, the strangers are no longer just tourists. They are us. The task of seeking historical explanations can be fun, but a tax on your patience. The origins of selected folklore, like some history, will never be entirely illuminated. In fact, it is only in recent years that professional folklorists have begun to seriously examine the historical roots of regional lore. However, the analytical sorting out of probabilities from possibilities is an exercise that all local historians should conduct. The Thong tree myth is one of these that we should present for discussion. Should it be labeled folklore or history? The answer to that may depend upon your commitment to folklore, history, or your role in regional promotion. There are a variety of reports about thong trees across the Ozarks. Carriers of the tale in different locales emphasize one aspect of the historic role of the thong trees over another. What follows is a composite picture. According to legend, thong trees were landmarks along the backwoods ridge trails. The shape of the thong tree was designed by Aboriginal people, Indians in the Ozarks. An oak sapling was the favored tree. It was young and supple and easily bent. Indians located an appropriate tree and bent the sapling into a horizontal pointer some 3 feet above the ground. It was bent over a Y-shaped thong embedded in the ground near the base of the sapling. Then a second Y-shaped thong or forked stick was inverted a few feet from the first, upside down over the sapling. The result allowed an upright branch to grow vertically from the Y of the second thong. After a few years, there appeared 2 rough-looking right angles in the tree and a horizontal saddle large enough to sit on. The thong tree's peculiar shape pointed the way to fresh, living water, that is, springs or all-season water, burial mounds, buried treasure, campsites, caves, medicinal plants, and more. Even though the thong trees were located along trails, promoters claimed that the tree itself had a functional use too. Indians took cured buffalo hides and, while wet, pulled them back and forth over the saddle in their work of making the hide pliable. Then the Indians hung the hides on a tree to dry. Promoters of this ancient lore attempted to authenticate their assertion by importing American Indians from Oklahoma or finding resident Indian descendants in the Ozarks to assure modern folks of the genuine history, that is, Indian heritage, of thong tree functions. By 1970, a number of thong tree converts began to mark the trees and make maps to locate them. Soon, the American Bicentennial provided enthusiasts with an event to herald this long overlooked issue in American history, and they had located several hundred thong trees across the Ozarks to prove their existence. I'll turn out the lights here. We'll be sure that we all know what we're talking about here. Let's see. of the things you can observe driving around new subdivisions in southern Missouri, like this one in Cape Girardeau County, on Shawnee Street, driving into Indian Hills, is the Thong tree sign right next to it that you can stop and take a look at on your entry and egress the subdivision. A number of books have been put out showing the manufacture of them, as I described earlier. A lot of the books being sold in the tourist industry, the peculiar shape labeled, and notice that these are particularly designed today for trail watching. Indians, as I mentioned, from Oklahoma and elsewhere, brought in to authenticate for a particular chapter of the DAR, the Garden Clubs, the trail. These trails are marked, some of them with very permanent signs, some with not so permanent, and sketches of many varieties are being diffused through a number of magazines and publications. And of course you can go out into the woods and photograph these, and you can find many thong trees yourself. And the National Forest Service in southeast Missouri, particularly in Reynolds County, has promoted some of these. You'll see this one here indicating that it was been around 1785, if you can, for this particular tree right here. And then groups of individuals. Of course, there's lots of small town newspapers because it's a great promotional item for the Chamber of Commerce to mark these. And as we'll see, the bicentennial really provided the benchmark for a lot of publicity with these. Like the Ozarks region in particular has a number of them marked by garden clubs and the DAR. Well, why should anyone be concerned about thong tree legends? Following the bicentennial in 1976, believers in the legend have brought their discussion into a number of public forums to lobby for their inclusion in Missouri history. I'll give you a few examples of what has gone on. Mrs. Laura Ubler of the Arcadia Valley Garden Club convinced a staff artist in the National Forest Service to draw the techniques for creating a thong tree. The drawings were used to promote the legend, while Ubler and others persuaded the National Forest Service to put up signs in southeast Missouri identifying thong trees. Secondly, in 1984, the first Missouri Parks Association organizational meeting was held at Lindenwood College in St. Charles County. This advocacy group was formed to bring about increased development in the Missouri park system. In a planning session for ideas to attract public support and government resources, one gentle lady asked, "What about the thong trees?" A curious but informative discussion followed, as several Missouri scholars in attendance had never heard of the thong tree. Thirdly, like old buildings, thong trees have occasionally become an issue for debate in government-financed cultural resource surveys. Promoters bring an emotional attachment to the thong tree, not unlike champions of all those old buildings that have such character. And fourthly, in 1989, at the first meeting for the Missouri Unmarked Human Burials Consultation Commission, the question of thong trees was again raised. Boosters, one an Osage Indian descendant, claimed that thong trees in a state park pointed toward Indian burial mounds. And again, the General Trails movement, marking historic corridors for heritage tourism, has now advertised Indian trail trees or thong trees as something tourists can watch for during outdoor drives or hikes through the Ozarks. And again, more writers are telling it for gospel, while pictures of purported thong trees are published in regional magazines and newspapers that want to add another attraction for the locale. Most recently, Branson Living joined the list with an article, Osage Guideposts, suggesting that the trees are more than an accident. Who has brought thong trees into Ozarks culture? The primary group has been the Federated Garden Clubs of Missouri, who were joined by the Daughters of the American Revolution. Their campaigns attracted support from local colored publicists who fed the mythology into Chamber of Commerce fanfare. The most influential promoter was Mrs. John Ubler of Ironton, Missouri, who in turn influenced Mrs. Mary Evans of Eldon, Missouri. After a successful effort in 1966 that led to the preservation of the Elephant Rock's geological features in Iron County, Mrs. Oobler took an avid interest in the freaks of nature found in the Ozarks forest, began cataloging trees with unusual formations, calling them Indian Trail or Thong trees, and enlisted the support of fellow Garden Club members to rediscover the lost Indian legend represented by the Thong trees. She was joined by the energetic Mary Evans, who was also captivated by the deformity of the trees while on an outing near Ironton. Locals in the Arcadia Valley told Evans they were Indian trees, and she later visited elders of Indian tribes to gain their input into the unusual tree phenomenon. Mrs. Evans eventually reported that there were more than 1,000 trees authenticated across the United States, some dating from the late 1700s, and that numerous tribes participated in the custom of creating thong trees. Excited by their apparent discovery, these Garden Club enthusiasts attracted the attention of members in the Daughters of the American Revolution. DAR chapters decided to mark the trail trees as a bicentennial project. The plaques that the organizations planted at the base of thong trees in 1976 documented the legend in many tourist locales. Roads leading into government lands, state and federal parks and campsites in southeast Missouri, roads around Lake of the Ozarks, and the Tri-Lakes country of the White River. Soon the National Forest Service, encouraged by one of their own artist employees and enthusiastic locals, had cooperated in making some of Mrs. Oobler's thong trees along scenic Highway 21 in southeast Missouri, and the marking of trees continues. Promoters of the thong tree are faced with considerable challenges from natural and cultural disciplines that study the past. These professionals contest and deny thong tree assumptions. I'll offer a brief summary of tree-raising consciousness and observations by scholars following that. The American discovery of Japan during the 1880s stimulated the American imagination in many things, including art, architecture, fashion, and yes, gardening. The Japanese had bent trees for centuries, creating thong-like productions that graced their landscape. American newspapers of the late 19th century, participating in the rhetoric of progress and improvement, published the design of these peculiar trees in the how-to columns of local papers, including those in the Ozarks. The first time that I noticed these columns was in the late 19th century Iron County Register in Ironton. Later, the era of the progressive agricultural movement of the early 20th century promoted creativity in rural gardens and tree planting, just as middle-class magazines did for suburban America. During the Depression, Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal roared into the Ozarks. The presence of the National Forest Service brought enormous attention to trees in the Ozarks. The service fought fires and began fire control, built roads, dams, dikes, and ponds, and planted trees, helping to bring thousands of Ozarkers back into a developing forest landscape. This Depression work also brought significant attention to trees in the form of tree contests that asked, where was the tallest tree of each species? Where was the oldest tree? Where was the thickest tree in diameter? Where was the largest canopy, etc. One of the most visible promoters for trees, in addition to the hundreds of local newspapers, was the State Chamber of Commerce publication, Missouri Magazine, a Depression serial published in Jefferson City. By 1929, Missouri Magazine was asking Missourians to be on the watch for freak trees of nature. These natural curiosities were photographed and small stories about them published. By mid-Depression, as the traffic to Missouri state parks increased and the new Missouri Department of Conservation began its work, journalists brought attention to the historic trees in Missouri. Not surprisingly, these historic trees were commonly located in locales frequented by tourists like the Kentucky coffee bean tree at the Jesse James Farm in Clay County, Civil War trees at the sites of important local events, hanging trees where lynchings took place, Daniel Boone's judgment tree near the Missouri River, a giant cottonwood at a proposed state park, a council tree at St. Genevieve where colonials decided local justice, and many more. The important result, of course, is that Missouri Magazine and other promoters encourage tree watching and ask the question, are there any historic trees in your locality? By the 1940s, a tree competition had emerged in several areas. The drought of the 1950s spawned more attention toward trees. Campfire Girls, Explorer, and Boy Scouts joined the Missouri Federation of Women's Clubs and other civic groups in replacing dead trees and creating sensitivity for live ones. Arbor Days for a time received widespread press. And by the 1960s, after all this tree watching for a generation, tree boosters in the Ozarks invented a term for an unusual shape of a tree, the thong tree. By now, community tree conservation and individual recognition set the stage that eventually led to the Liberty Tree markings, that is, the 200-year-old trees for the bicentennial. Scholars, in responding to journalists and local promoters, suggest a number of problems concerning the thong tree legend. Now I'll give you a brief summary of it. One, foresters in the Missouri Department of Conservation point out that the distinctive shape is often created by nature. One can go into any Ozarks forest and find one. Thong trees are indeed a common freak of nature. Secondly, most marked thong trees are of recent vintage, primarily late 19th century for the oldest ones, and simply do not date to the late 18th century and early 19th century periods claimed by promoters. Third, mention of thong trees or anything approximating the function of a thong tree does not appear in any explorer's accounts. This lack of evidence is extremely significant as the literature is extensive, and the existence of such a cultural phenomenon is exactly the kind of lore that 19th century ethnologists look for. Yes, Indians and whites mark trees, but why would they bend them? Fourth, burial mounds in Missouri are 500 years old and more. There are no thong trees of that vintage pointing to any of them. Moreover, the Archaeological Survey of Missouri, managed by the University of Missouri Anthropology Department, maintains a database of confirmed Aboriginal sites. That database is now in excess of 32,000 sites. Associated thong trees are conspicuously absent. Fifth, perhaps one of the most incredulous arguments against the historicity of thong trees is the insult to native intelligence. Go downhill for most any Ozarks ridge and you will eventually find water. You do not need a thong tree to point the way. Furthermore, in the pre-modern Ozarks landscape, one of an open climax forest cultivated by natural and cultural burnings for seasonal hunts, and a forest that contained well-beaten game trails leading to water, and when springs, creeks, and natural sinkholes ubiquitous across the land were easily encountered by fauna and aboriginals, why would Indians go to the considerable trouble of fabricating thong trees? It taxes even the most imaginable person. Ozarks culture, however, is not short on imagination. However, some time ago, social historians drew attention to factitious invented traditions, a set of practices which implies continuity with a suitable historic past. Although thong tree enthusiasts do not claim that nomadic Indians are still fabricating thong trees, the folklore of them does fit well into a modern festival architecture created for seasonal events in the tourist market. Like the growth of historical stories surrounding the Alamo and the Battle of Gettysburg, the legend of thong trees has joined the collective imagination of the Ozarks. Local journalists have written that tourists are among the most credulous creatures. In 1947, Jesse Russell, observing Ozark's promotional hype, wrote, "It would be something to laugh about were it not so closely related to tragedy. Actually, the sucker crop has been one of continuing profit for the stickers here for many years, and the end is not in sight." A generation later, not much had changed when new research began at the Center for Ozark Studies at SMSU in Springfield. Bob Flanders and I interviewed a well-respected politician, lawyer, and businessman and explained the historical background to a couple of Ozark myths. The gentleman cautiously admonished us, "Be careful with that knowledge and don't broadcast it too wide. Ozarkers have worked a long time developing a good market for their stories." Most recently, the usually reliable Missouri Department of Conservation has become beguiled by the legend. In a November 1994 article in the Missouri Conservationist, the department introduced the legend of the thong trees and quickly stated that, quote, "Historians have located several trees that they believe to be genuine thong trees." Certainly no professional historian or anthropologist would support such an assertion. Then the article suggested that to further document Missouri's cultural history, readers who have located thong trees should alert the department's Historic Trees program for listing. Tourists, load your cameras. Unquestionably, trees and a myriad of local subjects creatively promoted represent magnets for tourism and the fast-growing market for memory in the Ozarks and elsewhere. As far back as 1903, the year Charlie Barnes hit the rivers with his John boats, a commentator wrote that, quote, good Indian legends can be grown in almost any locality with a little care and attention. Our Appalachian cousins would unquestionably agree. If you don't think that legends of thong trees are important, just visit with the North Carolina Cherokees and ask them what tourists think about their roadside teepees. And we should not forget the advertising potential of the late Jim Owen. If he had known the thong tree concept, the famous Galena to Branson float of the 1930s to 1950s would have been through a ridgeline corridor of thong trees. Should thong tree legends come to an end in the Ozarks? Probably not. I still think the Ozarks is a great place to live. Thanks.